Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Carter Sneed. I'm the director of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion on Thomism, Now and Then. For those who might not be familiar with our work, the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture is committed to sharing the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and dialogue at the highest level across a range of disciplines. The Nicola Center is also the administrative home of Notre Dame's Maritain Center, which has been the university's flagship center for the study of Thomistic philosophy since its founding in 1957. Our dear friend John O'Callaghan, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Notre Dame, has served as director of the Maritain Center since 2006. John is a permanent member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and has served on the faculty at Notre Dame since 2003, where he also completed his PhD and today works on Thomistic metaphysics, Thomistic ethics, and medieval philosophy. Under John's leadership, scholars from around the world have traveled to Notre Dame to study and conduct research in the Maritain Center's extensive library and archive, advancing scholarship and exchange on Thomistic and medieval philosophy, and cementing Notre Dame's place as one of the preeminent universities for serious research in the Thomistic tradition. It was John's inspiration that was the genesis for today's conversation on the future of Thomism, and it seemed particularly fitting to host this conversation now, as this summer John passes the directorship of the Maritain Center to our colleague and friend, a faculty fellow of the Nicola Center also, Therese Cory, the John and Jean Osterly Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies at Notre Dame. I know Therese joins me and all of us at Notre Dame who are indebted to him in thanking John for his important work at the university, not just for his stewardship of the Maritain Center over these last 17 years, but for his own scholarship in the field of medieval and Thomistic philosophy, which has been a source of rare insight and inspiration to many of us gathered here today, both here physically but also remotely. We're being watched by beneficiaries of John's stewardship of the Maritain Center around the world. We have people zooming in from Italy and Asia, folks who have spent time at the Maritain Center who wanted to join us for this occasion. So to mark this occasion and this moment of transition, we thought we would reflect on where the field of Thomistic studies has been, where it stands today, and where it might be headed in the future. Hence, Thomism, Now and Then. Our panelists today bring their own keen insight on the subject to the conversation, but before introducing them, I'd like to first welcome a special guest this afternoon. Alasdair MacIntyre, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Notre Dame and a permanent Senior Distinguished Research Fellow of the Nicola Center, had hoped to join us for today's conversation. Unfortunately, Alasdair was not able to be with us today, but he asked our dear friend David Solomon, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Notre Dame and the founding director of the Nicola Center, to deliver his remarks that Alasdair had prepared for the occasion. David.
Thank you, Carter. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here on this occasion, especially to celebrate John O'Callaghan's time and Is this phone, or is this microphone working okay? Can you hear me? Okay. So let's begin briefly and we'll turn to Alasdair MacIntyre's remarks. We're all familiar with Alasdair MacIntyre's deep admiration, frequently publicly expressed, for John O'Callaghan as a philosopher and colleague in the philosophy department at Notre Dame, and also in his role as director of the Maritain Center. And as a friend to many of us, Alasdair was much looking forward to giving opening remarks for this O'Callaghan Fest this weekend. He had hoped to be present on this occasion, but a couple of physical issues made that impossible. I know how disappointed he was not to be able to deliver his remarks to John in person on this special day. In fact, we were just talking up until the very day of this conference when he hoped to be able to be here as a mark of his regard for John O'Callaghan and his work. He has asked me to read his text this afternoon, and I will try to do my best, but I doubt that it will be up to the standard of the real MacIntyre, as it were, in the raw. I will not, I fear, when I read these remarks, have that same buzz, or these remarks will not have that same buzz that attends Alasdair's presentations when he's in full battle mode, holding forth on a podium at Notre Dame, discussing, for example, the future of Thomism at the Maritain Center. We hope for some exciting conversation nevertheless, but we would love to have Alasdair here. Now, the title Alasdair gave for these remarks, and I will emphasize that, was this: the Maritain Center and John O'Callaghan, a celebration. That was his title. And I sort of regard that as capturing what Alasdair had in mind, a celebration of John O'Callaghan and what he has done at Notre Dame as a graduate student, as a teacher, as an administrator, and a sort of leader in the battle for Thomistic achievement. So, to Alasdair. The Maritain Center was founded to contribute to the continuing influence of the spirit of Jacques Maritain at Notre Dame. Maritain had first visited Notre Dame in 1934, and from 1938 to 1948, his former student, Yves Simon, taught in our philosophy department. Between them, Maritain and Simon were responsible for educating a generation of Notre Dame teachers who shared Maritain's conception of the educated Catholic layperson as someone whose life and work were informed by the insights and arguments of Aquinas, rethought in contemporary terms. But if this were to continue, Alasdair thought, in subsequent academic generations, others would have to do what Maritain and Simon had done. Hence the founding of the Maritain Center in 1957, with Joseph Evans as its first director. The singular achievement of the Maritain Center ever since have been the achievements of its three directors. Notre Dame has acquired a remarkable collection of books and papers by not only Maritain and Simon, but Thomistic scholars of every kind. The center has provided hospitality and resources for visiting teachers and students, as well as for our own teachers and students, to continue the work of Maritain and Simon. And the three directors have responded in turn to remarkable changes both in this university and in the culture at large. It was for the most part uncontroversial among Joe Evans' colleagues that academic teachers, especially teachers of philosophy, needed to learn from Maritain if they were to give their students what those students needed. By the time that Ralph McInerney succeeded him in 1979, a great deal had changed in the philosophy department. Thomism was now only one controversial standpoint among others. Maritain was no longer the influence that he had been among faculty in general. McInerney did what Maritain himself would have done. He focused not on Maritain, but on recovering Aquinas for a new generation. McInerney's Aquinas has three central characteristics, and for those of you who know McInerney's work, these are his central commitments. Aquinas' words are always and only Aquinas' own words. Aquinas' philosophical insights and arguments are only adequately to be understood by those who are attentive to Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle. And McInerney's Aquinas was a contemporary as well as a 13th century philosopher, something recognized by McInerney's appointment as a Gifford lecturer. But by and large, this was not recognized at Notre Dame, this third point. It remained for MacIntyre's successor, John O'Callaghan. We move to the center of the discussion. Successor to John O'Callaghan to reestablish and partially redefine the place and mission of the Maritain Center at Notre Dame. Like both Evans and McInerney, an excellent teacher, like McInerney, an excellent scholar and a first-rate philosopher, like O'Callaghan, and O'Callaghan has continued the Maritain Center's work as a place of hospitality for visiting scholars, both from elsewhere in the United States and from abroad, who desire to do for their own time and place what Maritain did for his. O'Callaghan's achievement, O'Callaghan's achievement has been recognized as was McInerney's, by permanent membership in the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. But O'Callaghan has distinguished his directorship by the way in which he understands the philosophical stance needed by someone who is now at work as a Thomist. O'Callaghan has advanced philosophical inquiry in two different ways. First, he has insisted that it is often through conversations between two rival philosophical standpoints, that of Aquinas and that of the relevant analytic philosophers, that truth emerges. So in one of his earliest publications on language and mental representation, he contrasted the views taken by Aristotle as understood and endorsed by Aquinas with those taken by Michael Dummett to remarkable effect. So Aquinas, for O'Callaghan, becomes visible as a contemporary philosopher, something that Maritain would have very much enjoyed. O'Callaghan's second enterprise has been to provide an original and extended treatment of Aquinas' discussion of misericordia and its implications for understanding what justice requires. So he has enabled those laypersons, both philosophers and others, who had been puzzled about what it would be to pursue Maritain's goals in contemporary terms to resolve their puzzles about justice. The Maritain Center has continued to be what it was from the start intended to be, and we are all very much in debt to John O'Callaghan for that fact. So join me in our celebration of John O'Callaghan at this luncheon this afternoon.
Thank you, David, and our thanks to Alasdair for his contribution. Professor MacIntyre sets up well the history of Thomistic studies, particularly here at Notre Dame, which gives us the natural opportunity to turn towards its future. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists who will offer some brief opening remarks before we hear from our honoree, John, and then move into broader conversation and discussion. Therese Cory, as I mentioned, is the John and Jean Osterly Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies at the University of Notre Dame, a member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, Director of the Notre Dame Maritain Center, elect, and a faculty fellow of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Professor Cory earned her PhD from the Catholic University of America, and her research interests include medieval theories of mind, cognition, and personhood. Thomas Hibbs is the J. Newton Razor Senior Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University, where he is also the Dean Emeritus of the Honors College. Hibbs earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame and served as a tutor at Thomas Aquinas College, professor and department chair of philosophy at Boston College, and president of the University of Dallas. His research interests include the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, contemporary virtue ethics, and aesthetics. Father Michael Sherwin is professor of fundamental moral theology and director of the Institute of Spirituality at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, in Rome. Father Sherwin taught for almost 20 years at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, as well as at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California, where he received his initial formation as a Dominican and was ordained a priest. His research interests include the psychology of love, virtue ethics, and moral development. Professor Cory.
Well, first of all, let me say what a joy and pleasure it is to be able to participate in this wonderful event honoring my dear colleague, John O'Callaghan. Being colleagues with John in the philosophy department has been a huge gift to me over the last 8 years. I've learned so much from all of our different conversations and John's immense witticisms, which are unparalleled. And so he leaves enormous shoes to fill, and it's really a pleasure to be able to be part of this discussion in honor of him. Thomism now and then. I want to reflect on a quote from a 1989 book by Gerald McCool called From Unity to Pluralism. In a telling passage at the end of the book, McCool writes, quote, "No one denies that other and more recent systems have discovered truths to which Thomism in the present state of its development cannot do justice. The Thomist's duty, however, is not to yield his place to the proponents of these other systems. The challenge before him is rather to absorb these truths and integrate them into the system structured by the changeless concepts of St. Thomas's perennially valid metaphysics. As a philosophical and theological wisdom, Thomism is not historically conditioned," end quote. And this quote intersects interestingly with our panel title, Thomism Now and Then. What does it mean for Thomism to be then or now? Is it true, as McCool puts it, that St. Thomas offers a, quote, perennially valid metaphysics structured by changeless concepts, which are not historically conditioned? In the manner of Aquinas, we might say, in a way, yes, and in a way, no. You have to say that. Consider, for instance, how the new scientific discoveries of Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Einstein systematically obliterated the entire medieval vision of the cosmos, the cozy nest of cosmic spheres within spheres, swaddling the Earth at its core, or the coordinated change of cosmic agents simultaneously acting to generate and move each creature on Earth through solar heat. These details don't matter, Thomists like to argue. The underlying metaphysics remain untouched. We just have to explain how atoms, too, are composed of form and matter, or that God's act of creation unfolds over longer time periods than originally thought. The basic concepts of form and matter, efficient cause, act and potency, all remain changeless and untouched. Or do they? If we understand a mollusk's form as dynamic, either capable of evolving under environmental pressures, or harboring potential for forms other than itself, is that still the same concept of form? If we drop the view that changes in the world around us are the result of a chain of concerted causes at every level of being, from God on down, simultaneously acting as one cause to produce a single effect in every natural change, what happens to the unity of the Thomistic cosmos? Can we still assume that a single metaphysics applies across the whole system if we can't be sure that the whole system is continually singing with one voice? The challenges of updating Aquinas' cosmology are nothing, of course, compared to discussions about human beings. Is the Thomistic concept of the human being also a changeless truth? And if so, how do we make it accommodate more recently discovered truths about the human person? I'm thinking, for instance, of things like John Paul II's beautiful description of human beings as being bound by what he calls the law of the gift. He wrote, quote, "Man who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself can fully find himself only through a sincere gift of himself," end quote. Aquinas speaks of gift-giving and well-wishing and interpersonal communion, but no discussion of self-giving in quite the JP2 sense leaps off the page. Or consider the UN Declaration of Human Rights contributed to by Jacques Maritain, which includes universal rights to seek asylum in another country, rights to be spared exile, torture, and slavery, rights for which one will search in vain in the Summa Theologiae. Now, I would be the first to rush out to highlight all sorts of remarks in the texts of Aquinas that might plug in nicely to these later insights. And as Thomists, this is a kind of party trick that you have to get good at. However, if we're being fully honest, we also have to admit that Aquinas fundamentally understands perfection in terms of optimally functioning natural powers, an approach that is not a great match with JP2's insights on self-giving. And again, if we're being honest, Aquinas fails to categorically exclude enslavement or exile, not as a merely practical omission, but as a matter of principle. So the best we can do without willfully twisting texts is to admit that Aquinas' basic concepts are friendly to being expanded to accommodate these newly discovered truths, but that the expansion requires some remodeling of the basic concepts. What I'm suggesting here is that basic Thomistic principles are not an unchanging ahistorical algorithm. such that new developments are just a matter of learning to apply the algorithm to a new data set. Rather, the algorithm itself cannot help being transformed by its new application. And yet, what's the point of being a Thomist, or of studying Aquinas as a great philosopher at all, if one doesn't think Aquinas has some kind of perennially true insights to offer us? This is obviously not a new problem. McCool himself is describing a debate that goes back to before the founding of the Maritain Center, and that Maritain himself later participated in. And I don't expect to offer some brilliantly new insight about it. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves of this problem now and then. What I want to suggest is that we should think of the basic Thomistic conceptual framework and philosophical concepts in general less like a set of changelessly valid axioms and more like images of what is. In other words, we have to approach concepts and even theories not like axioms or collections of propositions with truth values, but rather as thoughts, which are themselves images of being. Concepts are thoughts. Theories are thoughts. And thoughts are images of beings. The relationship of thought to being, of course, is an important theme in John's work, and so an especially fitting theme for us to discuss in celebrating him today. In his book, Thomist Realism and the Linguistic Turn, John writes that a concept is not a third thing between knower and known. Rather, he says, quote, "It is the informed activity of intellect as it grasps the thing outside the soul," end quote. This heretical comment ignited a scholarly firestorm in the pages of the ACPQ, as many of you know, but I think John was essentially right both then and now. In other words, a concept is not an item lodged in a mind repository, a mental tool, or device for thinking. Rather, concepts are thoughts, or to put it in more dynamic terms, concepts are thinkings. So when we talk about Thomas's concept of form, we're really talking about Thomas's thinking about form. And when we put it like that, it becomes clear right away that there can be no such thing as a changeless concept. Not for human beings in this life anyway, because we do not have any such thing as a changeless thinking that is incapable of further growth, or regression for that matter. That's why Aquinas states that, quote, "Our cognition is so weak that no philosopher could ever perfectly or completely investigate the nature of a single fly, which is why, so says Aquinas, one reads that a philosopher spent 30 years in solitude to know the nature of a bee," end quote. And this is not some kind of skeptical manifesto, but a sober acknowledgement of the open-endedness of human knowledge, which never reaches completion in this life. So if the nature of a fly is so hard to grasp, what about the nature of a human being on the horizon of the bodily and non-bodily worlds? And then there's metaphysics, the knowledge of being as such, which is even more indistinct than the nature of a fly or human being. How many years would we have to spend in solitude to achieve perfect thinking about the nature of form and matter, act and potency, efficient cause? Definitely more solitude than is good for us. What makes someone a Thomist then or now is not an adherence to a set of changeless metaphysical concepts construed as a set of perennially true propositions. What makes someone a Thomist then is the conviction that Aquinas' thinking expresses something of a perennial reality and the desire to think those thoughts along with him. It is the impulse of a child demanding to share her parents' headphones so she can hear the music too. Now, if concepts are thinkings, then what Aquinas bequeaths to us today is not a set of static propositions, but the opportunity to think living human thoughts, measured by things themselves. And this measuring relationship is something that John points out in another favorite piece of his, to which I return often, his presidential address for the American Catholic Philosophical Association in 2013. And there he says, Aquinas does not define truth in terms of correspondence, in the narrow sense of a correspondence between a judgment and a fact, in the style of Moore and Russell. He defines it in terms of an adequatio, which is not captured by the English word adequacy, as if we were to say that a statement in being true is adequate. Rather, he writes, Veritas est adequatio rei et intellectus, with the res, the intelligible thing, the measure of the intellect, end quote. Truth, in other words, is a thought's measuring up to things. And this insight is the key to the whole problem we're considering. The mistake would be to think of truth as a correspondence in which there's only two options, true or false, as a light switch is either on or off. My parents used to tell me that if you leave the light switch in the middle position, the house will burn down. But measuring up to a reality, in contrast, can occur along a gradient. The floor plan can approximate the home's real dimensions, better or worse. A portrait can be better or worse at capturing St. Thomas More's integrity. And similarly, a thought can be truer or falser to the thing that measures it on Aquinas' conception. A zoologist understands a panda better than I do. That means her thought or concept is truer than mine, and it has gotten gradually truer as she learns more about pandas. This is possible because thought is essentially a natural image that being makes of itself. Or as John puts it, quote, likeness is a natural relationship between concept and res, end quote. Our thoughts are the images that beings make as they shape us in their likeness. And an image, as we all know, is not on or off, true or false, relative to the original. An image always expresses something of its original, however obscurely, but it might be better or worse at doing so. Also importantly, images are partial expressions of the original. A play versus a Holbein portrait versus an impressionistic sketch each capture something different of St. Thomas More. And in fact, Husserl writes wonderfully about how, although our experience of an object changes when we view it from different angles, we're still able to knit those partial experiences together into an experience of one and the same object. Perhaps one of the newly discovered truths of phenomenology that Thomistic psychology should rightly be eager to absorb. So if concepts are thoughts and thoughts are images, then ideally, basic Thomistic concepts will not be left unchanged by the incorporation of new insights. Rather, they will expand and develop into truer and richer images of being. They are like a cake that each new generation has to learn to bake, continually integrating new ingredients and techniques. Though things can also go in the other direction. We might have forgotten what exactly Grandma did for the light texture that eludes us now. Maybe for John's sake, I should have said a cheese ball. Sometimes these expanding new insights might be water from the well of other philosophical systems. Other times they might come through a historical rediscovery of Aquinas' authentic thinking, sedimented over by archaeological layers of time. But I rather think that new insights may not always be commensurable with Aquinas' thinking. No thought image can express the whole of being, not then in Aquinas' own time, and not now. Perhaps there's a way of profiting from thoughts that can never be fully integrated into one's own systematic thinking. So what I want to suggest then is that Thomism is not a body of knowledge or a set of principles or even a set of texts. It is a kind of thinking, an act of vitality, a human performance, or as John puts it so elegantly in the title of his book, a more perfect form of existence. Thomism is a certain imitation of being, an activity of a concrete human person. And whenever it takes place, it can only do so now, and again now. Thank you, and congratulations again, John.
Thank you, Therese. Tom.
Carter, thank you for organizing this. A great idea, and I'm really honored to be here. Thanks to Margaret, as always, for seeing flawlessly to every detail. I'm not sure which one of you gave us the impossible assignment of talking about the future of Thomism in 10 minutes, but thanks to whoever did that. Therese, congratulations. I assign Therese's work on Aquinas on racism to my students every semester in moral philosophy. I'm really glad that you're taking over this position as John passes it on to you. Father Sherwin, always good to be with you. We're together in Rome a few weeks back. It is unfortunate in a way that Alasdair couldn't be with us, but how wonderfully fitting is it that our teacher, David Solomon, who first encouraged us to read Alasdair, got to communicate Alasdair's thoughts to and about John to him and us. It's wonderful. And thanks to John for letting us do this for him, although I think he probably feels like we need a different preposition. We're not doing something for him, but to him. So thanks for enduring your friends talking about you. I was looking around and noticed that upper level. I thought we should have sat him up there like a Roman emperor so he could give the thumbs down to us or thumbs up as we're speaking. I think he would have enjoyed that. I don't know about you, but when I think about the future of Thomism, I think about Patti Smith. In my Blakean year, I was so disposed toward a mission yet unclear, advancing pole by pole, fortune breathing in my ear, mouthed the simple ode, one road is paved in gold, one road is just a road. So throw off your stupid cloak, embrace all that you fear, for joy shall conquer all despair in my Blakean year. Mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, love a human form, peace a human dress. To mercy, pity, peace, and love for praying their distress. But mercy shall embrace, mercy shall embrace. Mercy, it's the mercy, it's the mercy. From the Patti Smith song, In My Blakean Year. I quote that. John and I were going back and forth by text a couple days ago about this. I quote it because toward the end I want to say something about John's work on mercy, which is a preoccupation. And those of you who know John, when I use the word preoccupation with respect to John, you know it is a consuming obsession that he gets about certain things. I recall visiting Notre Dame after I had left and John was working on his dissertation, and he had found a footnote in a secondary source that had led him back to a series of primary texts in Aquinas, which he had found the author who had written the footnote had not gotten right. So this preoccupation with the details of any subject matter is something I love and admire about John, even if that makes some of the texts I receive more like a peer-reviewed article than it does like an ordinary text. I do want to say something about John's work in a way that, given our time limits, will be much less than a review discussion, but I hope more than a blurb, remembering our teacher Ralph McInerney's comment about blurbs that they are a genre of fiction unto themselves. But what's a lie among a few friends? The Blake illusion calls to mind, for me at least, Thomas Merton, who in the late 30s at Columbia was working on a master's thesis on Blake, and in the midst of that discovered Jacques Maritain's Art and Scholasticism. And the combination of those two things did an awful lot to move him in the direction of wanting to study scholasticism and then to join the church. One of the things that Merton found in Maritain was Maritain's discussion of connaturality, a way of knowing directly and intuitively without abstraction or analysis, which is something that Merton uses to talk about Blake's poetry. What the poet apprehends in creative intuition is not an essence. Instead, the apprehension is directed to concrete existence, to the experience of the world, as Maritain puts it, in a soul pierced by a given emotion. Poetry is born in the root life of the artist, where the powers of the soul, sensation, imagination, feeling, and intellect are active in common. Merton finds in Blake a unification of the poetic, the contemplative, and the mystic. At one point in his thesis, he says, all Blake's work is ordered to mystical union with God. And in his secular journal written at about the same time, October of '39, he writes, just as prayer leads to stillness and timelessness in contemplation, so the action of a work of art leads to contemplation on an aesthetic level. And in this way, art provides some basis for talking analogically about the joys of heaven. What he found in Maritain, though, was a kind of corrective to Blake's tendency to fuse and render indistinct the mystical, the poetic, and the contemplative. We know that Maritain developed, particularly in his two great works on aesthetics, Art and Scholasticism and Creative Intuition, a series of analogies between the three. At one point, he writes, "There's a curious analogy between the fine arts and wisdom. Like wisdom, the arts are ordered to an object which transcends the human and which is of value in itself and whose amplitude is limitless, for beauty, like being, is limitless. They are both disinterested, desired for themselves, truly noble because their work taken in itself is not made in order that we may use it as a means." Not long after Merton read Art and Scholasticism with profit, Flannery O'Connor also did. Before the two of them, Rouault, Chagall, Cocteau, Stravinsky had profited from conversations with Jacques Maritain. There's pretty good evidence that Stravinsky's move in the direction of classical composition was influenced by conversations with Maritain. And I think there's actually a lot of work here that could be done in the future. Some has been done on Maritain's relation to these great artists. And in our own time, Dana Gioia, Makoto Fujimura, and especially Seamus Heaney in a famous essay, Sixth Sense, Seventh Heaven, where he talks about how he writes poetry, rely heavily upon Maritain's account of creative intuition. I think there are also a series of questions within Maritain's aesthetics that could provide good work for future research in contemporary Thomism, and even perhaps a comparison with the work of Fran O'Rourke on the influence of Aquinas on James Joyce. Maritain himself recognizes and approves of the fact that modern art involves an enlargement of the role of subjectivity. But Maritain's always careful to speak of the discovery of the subjective conditions of art as what he calls a double awakening, an awakening of the self to itself and to nature. The aesthetic insight that involves the grasping of the objective reality of both the inner and the outer world. Maritain worried that in certain strains of modern art, an accentuation of the subjective contributions to art could lead to a desire for a completely disembodied art. Art would thus renounce seeing into the inner depths of the world of nature, of visible and corporeal being. Maritain speaks at this point of art becoming walled in, and he makes a comparison to modern philosophical idealism. This philosophical idealism, called by Thomas Reid the way of ideas, running through Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and then criticized by numerous philosophers from Reid to Wittgenstein, Aquinas has been sometimes accused of anticipating. John takes this, as Alasdair mentioned and as Therese mentioned, as the subject, an occasion for correction in his book, Thomist Realism and the Linguistic Turn. And as Therese noted, Aquinas' theory for John doesn't render language or knowledge internal, private, or overly individualistic. It's more like John McDowell's account in its attempt to eliminate the dualism of the internal and the external. But Aquinas, John argues, is more successful than McDowell, since for Aquinas, language and knowledge do not constitute a sui generis form of life, untethered, as John writes, from the characteristically animal modes of human life, or at best with nothing more than a foothold in them. On the Thomistic picture, these aspects of human nature are really just a more perfect form of natural existence. On one level, John's work in that book is deflationary. We don't need this third thing, as Therese rightly noted. But it's also quite positive and rich. He moves us in the direction of considering a more perfect form of human existence. And this, I think, connects up with certain parallels in John's work on mercy. I want to focus in the last few moments especially on this recent essay of John's on failed persons. And I want to focus on that not just because I think it brings out an important parallel to John's work in Aquinas' theory of knowledge, but also because I think it brings out the joint work of John and his wife Mary, work that is at once scholarly, familial, civil or legal, and ecclesial. John takes up in this essay what he calls the social psychological criterion of personhood, namely the claim that we are human persons because we have crossed some threshold of development, of capacities of reason and will. We have come to conceive of ourselves as having a future, or become rational, autonomous agents. And insofar as we lapse from these capacities, or suffer debilities in our exercise of them, we risk becoming failed persons. And failed persons, as John rather bluntly puts it, can, according to a host of contemporary moral philosophers, be killed. But according to John, we are not human persons for these reasons. We are human persons because we are, from the beginning of our lives, set upon a course of development that includes, as stages of development, those capacities and many others beside. Human life, like animal life, is dynamic and developmental. Calling infant human beings healthy just marks that they will become social psychological persons with some ordinary help from us. Being a social psychological person does not come from nowhere, as if by metaphysical magic. Instead, it's a developmental stage in the life of a particular kind of animal, a human animal. Now, John goes on to note very pointedly in the midst of this essay that we should consider the fact that the specific moral character of our lives becomes more engaged when attending to weakness rather than strength. He talks about someone in India thinking about helping a child who appears to be homeless and the complications of thinking about what you ought to do and how you could do it. You'd have very limited options all by yourself. And we require, in trying to help those in our midst who have needs, not just the assistance but of other individuals, but also practices and communities that will help us respond to these needs and afflictions. I was reminded while reading this section of John's essays of Dorothy Day's mentor and colleague Peter Marham's claim that we need a society where it's easier for people to be good. I think that's the upshot of what John is talking about in that essay. And he quotes at the end Ambrose of Milan, quoting on the story of Naboth in the Book of Kings. And John says for the first time in extant Latin text, associating compassion with mercy, compassio with misericordia. Misericordia is not the habit of judging merit, but of giving assistance in necessities, of serving the poor, not investigating justice. Who then is it who understands the poor? This is Ambrose still. The one who is compassionate to him, who faces him as a natural friend. Not only does Ambrose bind mercy to compassion, but he grounds it in natural friendship. Not, as John says, friendship by choice, but friendship that one is bound to by being born into humanity. Here we return to Blake and Maritain and connaturality. But in this case, a connaturality not just of knowing through my personal inclinations or habits, but specifically through an inclination that unites my own passions, my sorrows with the sorrows and sufferings of others. And so we learn from this alternative account of human nature and human personhood that, as John concludes, vulnerability is not something to be overcome in a quest for autonomy. Our mutual vulnerability is what makes possible the great good of human friendship and solidarity that we are born to. And so we return to Patti Smith, to mercy, pity, peace, and love for praying their distress. But mercy shall embrace. Mercy shall embrace. Mercy. It's the mercy. It's the mercy. Thank you, John and Mary, for your scholarship and your friendship.
Thank you, Tom. Father Sherwin.
Well, tempus fugit, is this still on? Tempus fugit, so I will just echo all the other thanks that have already been stated and dive right into my text. Inside baseball, the future of Thomism and the mean streets of contemporary academia. Several months before I received this wonderful invitation to share my thoughts on the future of Thomism, I heard a lecture that made two astounding claims. First, the lecturer affirmed that Father Serve Theodore Pinckaers, my mentor, was part of the Thomistic commentary tradition. In other words, that Father Pinckaers read Thomas Aquinas from the perspective of the interpretations of Aquinas' work advanced by the Renaissance and Baroque scholastic commentators, the second scholastics, such as Thomas de Vio, Cajetan, or John of St. Thomas. Secondly, the lecturer affirmed that to be a true Thomist today, one must also read Aquinas from within this second scholastic tradition, engaging the questions they posed and drawing on their conclusions. I deeply disagree with these two affirmations. First, Serve Pinckaers and the commentary traditions. Father Pinckaers used to say that when you read a second scholastic commentator such as Cajetan, what you are reading is 50% Aquinas and 50% Cajetan. Pinckaers would explain that when Cajetan comments on a Thomistic text, he is guided by questions arising from his own day and employing Latin terms that have shifted in their meaning from the meanings they held in the time of Thomas Aquinas. Father Pinckaers asserted that these percentages also hold when any of us approach a medieval or classical text. When we first read Aquinas, it is often 50% Aquinas and 50% us. We can, however, change the percentages by becoming students of history, something that Cajetan couldn't really do. When we understand Tommaso de Aquino in his own historical context, his profile becomes sharper and his voice clearer, a voice that can speak to us across the centuries. In other words, we change the percentages. As students of history, when we read him, it is more him and less us whom we read. As Father James Weisseipel said so beautifully in his groundbreaking study of Thomas nearly 50 years ago, quote, "Strange as this may seem, unless the teaching of Aquinas is seen in its true historical perspective, there is not only the danger of misunderstanding his teaching, but also the danger of rendering Thomas irrelevant to our age. Therefore, some attempt must be made to understand the historical perspective in which Thomas thought and wrote, in order to appreciate the transcendental insights he contributed to man in every age," unquote. For this reason, Father Pinckaers read Aquinas not in light of the commentary tradition, but in light of Aquinas' biblical, patristic, and classical philosophical sources, and in the context of the controversies and concerns of St. Thomas's own day. Pinckaers felt it was by becoming conversant with this historical Aquinas that Aquinas could still speak meaningfully to us today. As to the future of Thomism, I do not have a crystal ball that would let me see the course that Thomism will take. But I believe I can say with some confidence that if students of Aquinas primarily follow the path of the commentary tradition, then Thomism will risk, as Father Weisseipel warned, quote, "rendering Thomas irrelevant to our age," unquote. By following this course, Thomistic studies will increasingly become the domain of an ever smaller group of specialists whose work will be of interest the way inside baseball is of interest to a select group of statistic-hungry aficionados, but not of interest to the vast majority of baseball fans. But if this is so, what should the future of Thomism be? A first feature of this answer should already become clear. If Thomistic studies is to have a future, it must make every effort to understand Thomas Aquinas from within his historical context and in light of his biblical, patristic, and philosophical sources. This, however, is only one aspect of a healthy future Thomism, for philosophy and theology are never reducible merely to the history of ideas. Philosophy is the ordered love of wisdom, while theology is the study of the God of love, who reveals himself to us through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And this God and his wisdom are both ever ancient, but also ever new. To have a future, Thomism must also live in this newness. Specifically, as working philosophers and theologians, students of Aquinas would do well to develop the habit of asking what Aquinas would do if he were with us today. What questions would he address, and what tools of analysis would he develop? An adequate answer of this twin question would require a lifetime to answer, or at least an hour's lecture, and I have about 2 minutes. So I will just note two features. First, I believe Aquinas would take advantage of our deeper and more readily available access to biblical Hebrew and to ancient Greek, and the historical and cultural studies, especially of the Septuagint, that have emerged with this deeper access to classical languages, something that far too few students of Aquinas avail themselves of, to resolve some of the difficulties Aquinas encountered in developing both his Christology, his study of the Trinity, and his description of the virtues and the life of grace. I could go off and give examples of the biblical understanding of Tzedakah, what Aquinas would do to that if he had access to that, how Luke uses the Gerardine demoniac as the incarnation of what the person of Sophrosune, and how that would help him to see the inadequacy of translating Sophrosune as temperantia. You can go on and on how these studies would have helped him in his effort to develop his theology. He would have loved it. All right, so that's just one. Second, I think Aquinas would be bemused by how rationalistic Thomism had become, and he would recognize how inadequate this scholastic rationalism is for addressing the challenges that confront us today. I believe that he too would return to the rough ground of human experience to offer a renewed account of the philosophy of nature and of the humble moral principles of that human reflection on human action can still provide us, when this analysis takes seriously the context of moral learning, the communities of discourse. In other words, Aquinas would study the insights of Professor MacIntyre. These, however, are just two directions I believe St. Thomas would pursue if he were alive today. Others would no doubt, from their own experience and reading, propose other features. The important point is that if Thomism is to have a healthy future, this is the question that we should be asking. What would Thomas Aquinas do? So at this point, to help us in this task, I thought it would be appropriate to provide the privileged few who are in attendance here at this lunch a simple memory aid, and I'm going to ask the two, Catherine and Caroline O'Callaghan, to help me distribute this memory aid. I will give John his own. It's a wristband that just says WWTAD. What would Thomas Aquinas do? Now, as this is being distributed, I wish to conclude with a quotation that I believe well describes the ideal Thomistic philosopher, especially in the context of the mean streets of the secular or secularizing institutions that many students of Aquinas are forced to walk. It also especially fits the character of the philosopher who is in the spotlight at this lunch. And for this reason, I have decided not to inclusivize the quotation's 1950s English. A philosopher, Ralph McInerney would remind us, is like a detective. He seeks the truth, and his search can be a dangerous one. What Raymond Chandler said of the detective, therefore, is thus well applicable, with slight modification, to the student of Aquinas, who we are celebrating, and to the ideal Thomist, I hope, will always be among us. And so now, Raymond Chandler. Down these mean streets, a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor. By instinct, by inevitability, without thought of it, and certainly without saying it. He is a relatively poor man, or he would not be a philosopher at all. He is a common man, or he could not go among common people. He has a sense of character, or he would not know his job. He talks as the man of his age talks, that is, with rude wit, a lively sense of the grotesque, a disgust of sham, and a contempt for pettiness. Thomistic philosophy, and I continue the quotation, is this man's adventure in search of a hidden truth, and it would be no adventure if it did not happen to a man fit for adventure. He has a range of awareness that startles you, but it belongs to him by right, because it belongs to the world he lives in. If there were enough like him, the world would be a very safe place to live in, without becoming too dull to be worth living in. That is the John O'Callaghan I know, and that is the Thomism that he has promoted. A Thomism that is both worth having, a Thomism that is worth having a future, one that makes philosophy a safe place to live in, but also a place that is never dull. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Sherwin. Now we're going to give our honoree a chance to respond briefly before we open the floor to broader questions and conversation.
Wow. You could all be better off in terms of what's to come, going back to your cars and putting your iPhones, or sorry, I'm so a little bit verklempt.
Your earphones.
And I can't think of the word. Your earphones and listening to the music of the great Tony Bennett, who died today. When this idea came up, and I think it was Randy who had it, of doing something with my stepping down, he initially said, well, we could do something about what you've done, your work. I said, no, that would just be too bad, too awful. So I said, let's just do something about Thomism, think about Thomism now and then, which I love, and I think Ralph would love the levels of pun in that. I think to him it would sound like a cocktail party. But I am very honored by what has been said here. about me. Not all of it is lies. A good deal of it is, but not all of it is lies. I'm reminded of when there was a conference in honor of Ralph when Tom and I presented him with a Festschrift, and he told me later that Bishop Darcy came up to him and said, well, Ralph, how do you feel? And he said, Bishop, I've been feeling posthumous all day. I don't feel posthumous. I feel maybe on the way, but I really am very much honored by these people who are such good friends, some of them old friends, some of them not yet old friends like Therese, but long enough friends. Well, no, that sounds bad, doesn't it? Very good friends for a while now. And I do appreciate the effort to connect up what I have done in my own work with the tradition of Thomism. When I think about Thomism, I think about these traditions that Alasdair mentioned and has written about, of trying to engage the world in a philosophical way against the background of, but not simply repeating, the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And I very much appreciate the way in which Therese went through that it's not this kind of, concepts reified into eternal objects, but it's a living thing. And of course, Ralph would point out that all of this, and the reason we have this here at Notre Dame, is the great encyclical Aeterni Patris, which had really two goals. Well, Russ Hittinger would say, actually, it had a third goal, but I won't go into that. But one was the idea of recovery, but recovery with a telos, with a goal, the goal of engaging contemporary thought and contemporary culture, not just thought, but contemporary modes of life, politics, art, science, all of these things. And that's really been what I've tried to follow up in that line of people, Joe Evans, Ralph, and now me. That's what I've been trying to do, is to say we're trying to contribute to something from a distinctive perspective. It's not the only perspective on the world and on culture and on art, but it is a very, very valuable perspective stemming from the work of Aquinas, but then also, as Therese would point out, and does very well in her work, against the background of his own sources, right? He didn't spring full-born from the head of Zeus. I like the story about being hit by lightning when he was 5. And the reason I like it is because I sometimes think that some people who write about Aquinas think that lightning was just a big information dump, and it just kind of went into his head, and the question was always, will he have enough time to write it out? Well, he did write 8 million words, but which I calculated one time in my obsessive character there, Tom. I calculated to be about 180 50,000 word books in the course of his life. But there are differences and there are changes as he enriched his thought, his thinking, and I really appreciate that you picked up on that, Therese. But one thing I would dispute with you is that image of the solitary effort. And maybe that you weren't suggesting that, but I've always thought of it as a division of labor, right? Not just in the study of Thomas, but just in engagement with culture. I mean, no one of us can do everything. And one way I thought of thinking of that as you were all talking was, I've always tried to see the human being in the philosopher. We all come from these different backgrounds, long before those of us who study Thomas, but I think it would be true of all my colleagues. And I am very deeply grateful for the presence of my colleagues from the philosophy department today. We all come from very different backgrounds. I was a physics major. I wanted to be a history major, but my dad discouraged that, so I did physics. But I ended up doing philosophy. There's no question that having been a physics major affected the way in which I sort of look at the world and think through philosophical issues. But I also went to a very good liberal arts school where I had to study different things. I didn't study them enough. I think of Tom, whose contributions tend to focus on literary, poetic, you saw that in his presentation, and art. And again, I think of Maritain in that context. One of the points I sometimes make to students and to friends is that Thomas Aquinas does not have something to say about everything. Neither is Thomas Aquinas anticipating everything that is current. One of the things that drove me crazy in graduate school was the way in which some new theme would come up in philosophy, the newest thing. I think the only one that somebody never tried to make Aquinas was a connectionist, and we won't go into what connectionism was. But there's this kind of urge sometimes to say, well, oh, this is the going thing. Thomas anticipated that. And an awful lot of the time I wanted to say, no, he didn't. And he has nothing to say about that. And this is a bit of a heresy, one of the things I think that's true of is when people talk about Thomas's aesthetics. I think Thomas had next to nothing to say about beauty, if you look at what he said. What's interesting about Maritain, and I think that as an ideal, and Ralph saw this, is that Maritain managed to develop an aesthetics against the background of Thomas without claiming that Thomas anticipated this. That's, I think, an ideal of what a Thomist should be now and then. And that was against the background of his own life, the human being in the philosopher. Some people would say that's a genealogical fallacy. Oh, you're just trying to explain away. No, I'm not trying to explain away. I'm trying to explain the way in which people see things. And in that respect, it's really a communal effort, a division of labor. So you have the marvelous historical studies that Therese does, but they're not mere history. They draw out the philosophical insight that is in Thomas against the background of his sources. And that philosophical insight can be brought to bear, not as if it just anticipated something, but in fact can be brought to bear. You have Tom with all of this artistic and literary and political background, able to sort of think through how you might talk about these issues in the contemporary world without claiming that Thomas Aquinas said this first. And then you have theologians like Father Sherwin, and I also thank and would like to recognize my other colleagues from outside the department, history, theology, architecture, who also, I'll say this much. As I've worked on Misericordia and Aquinas, I really have come to understand, and I'm sorry, more heresy, he's a theologian. And he puts philosophy to use in theology. There's simply no question about that. And you don't understand what he has to say about Misericordia and justice and the virtues unless you see it as his effort to use philosophy within the context of theology. And so the kinds of things that Father Michael does that bring all these things together, both his philosophical training, but his horsemanship, if you've ever heard him talk about horses in philosophy and theology, it's a division of labor. It's a social thing. It's not a solitary thing. And so I appreciate everyone in this room who has come here in the spirit of this division of labor, whether you're a Thomist or not. I appreciate the fact that I live in a community of human beings first, persons that we are born to cherish and love and understand. And that's whatever else happens to Thomism in the future, wherever Therese takes the center, that should always be its form of life, a communion of persons in pursuit of the truth. One last thing about Ralph was, I remember the time he said to me, there's no such thing as Thomism. All there is the love and pursuit of truth, however imperfectly we do it. So thank you for coming, and actually, those were longer than I wanted them to be, but we want to open it up to questions from the floor or comments. No throwing knives. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my beautiful wife and my two beautiful daughters. Mary couldn't be here at the beginning. She had a funeral to attend.
Thank you, John. Friends, please, if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, go to the microphone, which is Margaret appears to be adjusting.
And can I make a request that the head
actually-
table receive coffee?
You know what, I think Bridget is going to move the microphone to you. So raise your hand, and she will bring the microphone to you, and you can make your intervention if you want.
So I'm going to repeat the request for coffee for the head table.
Someone bring Father Sherwin coffee, please.
Just coffee is fine.
Black's good for him. He likes it unadulterated, please.
Probably.
All right.
I mean, you would like some coffee too. It's a community thing, it's like John was saying.
It's a decaf? Hold on, we're looking.
Terry,
We got it.
you can give that to Tom.
Thank you, Father Terry.
No, this is fine.
So one of the things I tell students is that a good student interrupts. We teachers love it when students and or colleagues intervene, because being the sort of person I am, although mildly embarrassed today, which has made me struggle to speak coherently, I can talk all day, as anyone who knows me knows. So we really would like it or appreciate it if you keep me from talking all day, because otherwise I'm going to talk about my dad.
So,
Take the microphone, Francesca.
Thank you for such great lectures. They were really, really enjoyable. Can't think of anything else to say. I gotta sit down.
that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, here we go. Oh, Randy.
Yeah, thank you again for all this marvelous stuff, particularly because, when we thought about this, John was very, very clear. Do not make this about me. And I thought to myself, yeah, that's not going to... Anyway, so I know how embarrassed he is, and that makes me really happy. But no, this of course is really, really interesting. But here's the thing about a conversation or a communion of persons. Right? What brings about the unity of that conversation, right? What brings about the fact that somehow we're not all talking in different directions, okay? And actually also in every talk, right, as generous as it was, and they were, there's always a slight sense of like, yeah, but we can't do that. Right. So there are ways in which it's like, yeah, but that wouldn't quite be the right thing. Right. So again, those are I guess the two questions. How do you bring about the unity in the conversation? I mean, goodwill, I get that. But I mean, like a unity of meaning in the conversation that we want to have, within Thomism. And then how do you distinguish the authentic from those things which you want to say, like the Baroque or something like, yeah, that's not necessary, or that's not going to be the kind of thing that we really think Thomism should be, right? So those are my two questions.
John, do you want to take a crack first? And then it looked like Father Michael wanted to say something. I could tell from his body language he was wanting to say something.
The unexamined life is not worth living. My father used to respond, the unlived life is not worth examining. I think my kind of response to that, at least off the top of my head, would be to go back to something that Therese emphasized, which in my case was just emphasizing something in Thomas, and that is what the unity consists in is that we all live in this world. Now, there are philosophical problems involved in the way in which the world is represented and so on, but letting reality be the measure of us, right? Man, the measure of all things. Well, that's a different view, right? But letting reality measure us becomes both the unity that binds us, the reality we find ourselves living in, And then also the humility before that reality to allow it to shape the way we think. It's not one of the early things I learned from Etienne Gilson, reading Gilson, was the difficulty of talking about conceptual schemes, as if you choose conceptual schemes. It's a kind of pluralism of abstract thoughts that are eternally what they are and so on. I never chose a conceptual scheme in my life. And I wouldn't even know how to begin to do that. I'm not sure it has any sense in the Wittgensteinian sense. But reality is what binds us together if we allow it to measure what we say and do. And it will strike back if we don't pay attention. It's the measure. That's very abstract, but I think that's what binds us, is not what I will, but how I respond to what has been willed for me.
Yeah, I don't know how this turns on.
It's on the top. There you go. It is on, isn't it? Might be out of battery.
Borrow John's.
Here.
Yeah. So I was going to say something very similar. I think it's the big question today. What are the minimal requirements of shared vision for a pluralistic conversation to occur? That confronts us in every level of our society. I think about what someone like Miss Anscombe would say, or any of the ladies at Somerville. She was at St. Hugh's, but I think what they would say, that you have to have at least a common commitment that there is the true, the good, and the beautiful, and that it is knowable, at least some minimal knowability, and therefore you can have a beginning of a conversation. But then sooner or later you're confronted with that commitment to the true, the good, and the beautiful also historically has been made possible in communities of faith. And so what are the minimal requirements of a shared faith for philosophy itself to exist? And that's a very large question. It's a question that it's still an open question in the American experiment, to how much longer we as a society will allow this type of conversation to occur. So, yeah, but I think it has to be a common commitment to, I remember Orwell, but already before Orwell, Chesterton. In 1984, Winston Smith says, truisms are true, hang on to that. Orwell foresaw, as Chesterton did at the beginning of the 20th century, that eventually people were going to go to jail for saying that water is wet, stones are hard, fire burns. And so it remains an open question whether institutions and the kind of thing that the Maritain Center has been devoted to can continue to exist. When the Gestapo got to Paris, one of the first things they did is go to see if they could find Maritain at the Institut Catholique. Happily, he was on tour here in the United States. They also chose his Moudon home to be the headquarters of the Gestapo. So the Maritains never felt they could go back there because it had been a place of torture. So no, these are very, very vital questions. I don't have an easy answer, but I will say a vignette that's much happier. I used to go up to the 7th floor as a doctoral student, and at the 7th floor of the Hesburgh Library, and there was the Medieval Institute to the left, and then on the right there was the Maritain Center. And I would go in there to see if I could have an audience with the great man, Dr. McInerney, and Alice, his Cerberus, a very smiling Cerberus, would be in her office to keep people like me out so that Ralph could do some work. But inside the center, there would be Mike Letney quietly writing his dissertation. And then across from him, there would be John O'Callaghan leaning back in a chair, often with his feet up, in conversation, nonstop, with this gentleman, the future Dr. Smith. And Dr. Smith would wander the Maritain Center like a caged lion, and they would be having a conversation that seemed unending. And I used to think, how are they ever going to finish their doctorates? But then I visited the married student housing, with its paper-thin walls and all the people around. And I said, oh, I see how they're going to finish their doctorate. They're writing their doctorates quickly so they don't all go crazy. Yeah, so there was a community that the Maritain Center, a community of conversation that the Maritain Center fostered. And I think it's a tribute to that. I think our presence here is a tribute to that.
So I think we have time for one last question. You choose, Bridget.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Very nice.
Thank you for all the presentations. I would like to know which are, in your opinions, your future challenges for all Thomistic people, all Thomistic scholars, and in which sense we can create this type of team labor. And I'm thinking not only here in Notre Dame, but also in collaboration with other universities around the globe. So especially in my case, Italian and Spain, but it could be all around the globe, obviously.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very first part about, about Europe.
Which are the challenges in front of we need to answer? I mean, you said before that we need to work to answer in front of the challenges our societies are asking on. So which are these type of challenges, if I can know?
I'll say something and then others can join in. Again, I worry a little bit about the idea of answering these things, because one thing I think we find from the history of philosophy is answers are very short-lived. But responses, how do we respond? I mean, I think we want to look at, against the background of my own experiences, we want to look at what are specific challenges to the common humanity that binds us together, as Ambrose said, natural friends. What are the things that are tearing that apart? Because even as theoretical endeavors like literature or history or theology, philosophy, they can't take place except in a context of relative peace. And I think in a practical vein, what Thomism could do is look and say, what's tearing us apart? But also, begin by listening, not jumping too quickly to an answer, not jumping to, well, this is what Thomas Aquinas would say. Because it, again, might be something he has nothing to say, but there's stuff in him that you could work up into or sort of expand the way Maritain did into human rights language, into aesthetics and so on. And, very specific questions from both a theoretical and a practical matter. Transhumanism, AI. I think AI, if some Thomists, against the background of great historical work, were to see themselves as, well, we need to think more about what intelligence is, and how to think about this in relationship to human life, both its influence on human life, but then also what is this thing that we're talking about? I have no idea how to think about AI. I know a lot about how it works because of my background, but I just think to myself, well, I'll start worrying when it's not artificial intelligence anymore, because that will be a big transition. But I don't quite know what I mean by that. So I would say look at the culture around you, and whether it's in the arts, whether it's in politics, whether it's in philosophy, literature, poverty. Again, Thomas had theological things to say about poverty. But we can't just look at Thomas and say, okay, now what do we do with economics and advanced capitalism? I think this is one of the great aspects of Alasdair's background, right, is bringing to bear the question of advanced modernity and poverty, right? What do we do there? We can't just say, well, where does Thomas talk about that in the commentary and the sentences? Because I know he doesn't talk about that in the Summa. I've looked, right? So that, I think, is the thing, is you got to identify what the things are that tear us apart, because I think it's a matter of a communion coming together behind Professor Smith's question.
Therese or Tom, do you guys want to jump in? Or
I guess to that, I would say I'm completely in agreement with everything that John just said. And I would also add that John has been so successful in making the Maritain Center over the last many years to be a home for people who want to come to Notre Dame and think about these issues and research and think about the ways that Thomism can say something to our contemporary culture, what kind of contributions it can make and what it can learn. And I really hope that in the future, the Maritain Center will be able to continue those kinds of relationships and continue to build those kind of relationships. We're really excited to see how that develops.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and Professor Solomon again for participating today. And I'd like to recognize the amazing staff of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. And in particular, I'd like to single out Margaret Cabanis and Brooke Tranton for their extraordinary work on today's event. So if we could give our thanks to them, and thanks to all of you as well.